Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I stand before you tonight to make the case for the motion. And as I do, a number of names and faces flash through my mind. People who are counting on me and on you tonight to speak for them in this debate, to give them a voice tonight with your votes. Jane Al-Hathrul, for example, a young women's rights activist who was jailed in 2014 for trying to drive her car in Saudi Arabia. Upon her release from prison, she went to live in the UAE, where last March, she was grabbed on the side of the freeway, put in cuffs, thrown on a private jet, and taken back to Saudi Arabia against her will. Today, aged just 29 years old, she sits behind bars for the temerity of asking for women to have the right to drive. Lujain, according to her sister, as we speak tonight, is being held in solitary confinement, where she's been beaten, waterboarded, electrocuted, sexually harassed, and threatened with rape and murder. Isra al-Ghamgham is also 29 years old. She's a young Shia human rights activist arrested with her husband in 2015 for carrying out peaceful protests, not for anything violent. And yet Saudi prosecutors are seeking to behead her, to execute her. She would be the first female human rights activist to be executed in this way. According to Human Rights Watch, Isra has not been charged or convicted with any acts of violence or even anything, quote, resembling recognizable crimes. The blogger Raif Badawi had his 35th birthday last month behind bars. He hasn't seen his kids for 7 years. He was sentenced for the crime of apostasy to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes, 50 of which he's already had to endure. His wife says his health has deteriorated in prison and he won't survive another round of flogging. Amal Hussein was 7 years old, a little girl in Yemen, the same age as my daughter. She posed a threat to no one. And yet there she was in that harrowing photo in the New York Times last November, her emaciated body, stick-like arms. Within a week of that report, she was dead, literally starved to death. We in the West saw her picture, we saw her haunting eyes, and yet we did nothing to help her. We've done nothing to help the other 1.8 million severely malnourished children in Yemen who are suffering from a famine and a cholera crisis caused by a Saudi-imposed blockade. And then there's Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal, who was sitting with me in the green room at Al Jazeera English last March, as we joked about his security while the Crown Prince was in town in DC. Less than 7 months later, he was dead. Brutally murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, his body allegedly cut to pieces with a bone saw. And murdered, remember, according even to the CIA, on the direct orders of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget these people tonight in this debate. Lujain, Isra, Raif, Amal, Jamal, people who have been killed, dismembered, tortured, flogged, imprisoned, starved, sexually assaulted at the hands of our ally, our close friend, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Tonight we come together to demand accountability, to demand justice, to demand an end to impunity, an end to economic and political blackmail. Tonight it's time we make clear that the West needs to cut its ties with Saudi Arabia, especially military ties, arms sales, weapons exports, bombs. I'm guessing we'll hear a lot of whataboutism tonight from the opposition. A lot of excuse-making from the opposition. What about Qatar? What about Turkey? What about Iran? Defenders of Saudi Arabia often say. And those countries, yes, have major human rights abuses. Trust me, I know I've interviewed the leaders of all of them, including the Qataris, and asked them about those human rights issues. Let's be clear, tonight's debate is about Saudi Arabia. Don't allow yourself to be distracted by the opposition. But also, here's the thing to remember. When it comes to dictatorship, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to the export of extremism and sectarianism, when it comes to the funding of terrorism, none of those other countries come close to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are the Premier League champions at this stuff. We all know that. It's not breaking news. I doubt even the Saudi defenders here in this hall tonight will contest this point. They know it. What they'll try and say to you, I'm guessing, is that yes, knowing what we know about Saudi Arabia, we should all be concerned. We should all be upset. We should all be outraged. But we shouldn't do anything about it. We certainly shouldn't cut any of our ties because, remember the whataboutism, what about the cost of cutting ties with Saudi Arabia, they'll say. What about the fact that our economies need Saudi Arabia? Which isn't a fact, by the way, it's complete hyperbole. In 2017, US exports to Saudi Arabia accounted for a whopping 1.1% of US exports. In 2016, here in the UK, British exports to Saudi Arabia accounted for 1.3% of overall UK exports worldwide. What about the oil, they say? Well, the United States is now the world's biggest producer of oil. In fact, the US has produced more oil than Saudi Arabia for 4 straight years in a row. By the way, isn't it about time we stopped allowing the Saudis to use their oil to try and blackmail the rest of the world? What about intelligence sharing, they say? What about the war on terror? President Trump said last November that we can't abandon the Saudis because, and I quote, they're leading the fight against radical Islamic terrorism. What? Are you kidding me? We're supposed to thank them for trying to sort out the terrorism problem that they helped start? And before we forget, Saudi Arabia is allied on the ground in Yemen right now with Al-Qaeda. They're working with Al-Qaeda on the ground, according to reporting both by the BBC and the Associated Press. They're also the second largest source of foreign fighters to ISIS. 2,500 Saudis have signed up with that group. And as a leaked US State Department cable famously put it, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. So ladies and gentlemen, asking the Saudis to help lead the fight against terrorism is like asking the mafia to help lead the fight against organized crime. It's like asking Donald Trump and his kids to lead the fight against nepotism and corruption. It's absurd. Let's be serious here. There is a reason why the Algerian novelist Kamal Daoud famously wrote that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is basically an ISIS that's made it. An ISIS that's made it. So why? Why are we so closely allied with such a kingdom? Well, what about Iran? They say we need Saudi Arabia against Iran, even though the last time I checked, there were 15 Saudis on those planes, not 15 Iranians. But even if you're worried about the threat posed by Iran, note how every step that the Saudis have taken in recent years has helped and empowered Iran. They bombed Yemen and pushed the Houthi rebels closer into the arms of Iran. They blockaded Qatar and pushed Qatar and Iran together. They prompted the Iraqi government to invite in Iranian militias to fight in Iraq against insurgent groups, many of whom were quietly backed by the Saudis. MBS, Mr. Bonesaw himself, the Saudi crown prince, who was behind almost all of those decisions, he's basically the reverse Midas. Everything he touches turns to shit, right? It's the reverse Midas effect. And that is the ally, that's the ally we need to cut ties with. That's the man, the ruler who we need to keep our distance from, both metaphorically and physically. And let's be clear, this is not about attacking Saudi Arabia, the country. I want to be clear tonight. Or being anti the Saudi people. It's about standing up to an out of control and pernicious Saudi government. In fact, we've screwed over the Saudi people for decades. Opposition groups, religious minorities, women's rights activists, journalists, dissidents. We have thrown them under the bus by cozying up to the Saudi regime, by propping up the Saudi regime, by deepening our ties with Riyadh instead of cutting down our ties with Riyadh. Let's also be clear about the wording of this admittedly awkwardly worded motion that we have before us. Cut ties doesn't mean blockade them or bomb them. It doesn't mean we treat Saudi Arabia like Saudi Arabia treats Yemen. We're not calling for regime change either. But what it does mean is we no longer treat them as our BFF in the Middle East. We no longer supply them with bombs that they then use with our assistance to flatten schools, hospitals, bakeries, flour mills, power stations across the poorest country in the Arab world. It means we no longer cover for them at the United Nations or help get them a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, as David Cameron so shamelessly did. It means we do not call on our governments to roll out the red carpet for the Saudis every time they come to town, as Crispin literally did on the BBC last March, roll out the red carpet for MBS. That's what we mean by cutting ties tonight. That's what we're arguing for. That's what we want you to vote for tonight. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of people out there watching this debate. They're going to be watching on YouTube elsewhere. Saudi princes, Saudi trolls, arms dealers, the torturers outside Lujain al-Hathalul's prison cell. We need to send them a message that tonight we draw a line in the sand and we say no more. We will not allow you to thumb your nose at international law. We will not allow you to ignore basic global norms of decency and human rights. We will not allow you to get away with cold-blooded murder in Istanbul. We will not allow you to strangle an entire country and create the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world.